Do you think there's any chance now she might just have gone missing and may turn up?
I can't see it. It'll be a miracle if she does. Like, I hope she does, but like, it'll be a miracle.
Arlene Arkinson has been failed. And failed simply because she's a 15-year-old girl who never came home. The family has been failed. They have been re-traumatised and re-traumatised as time has gone on. Women have been failed in the sense that we are no safer now in 2021 than we were in 1994, than we were in 1965.
Women fear the violence of men, and many experience it. They have a terror of Badlands, places that are lonely, abandoned, on the margins, places where they sense that harm has been done, where it seems that anguish is trapped. They hear the crack of a boot on branches, sense a shadow on the doorway. They imagine an unheard scream. A violated body dumped without ceremony. If they have to pass that way, they hurry. Dread at their heels. Their fear is a kind of terrorism that somehow manages to thrive in our culture. For most women who are murdered, the predator is a man they know, even a man they love. The setting is often the place that is meant to be the safest. Home. But then there are men who are hunters of women. They groom, they stalk, they snatch, they kill. They know their way around the Badlands. They can map rutted tracks and follow paths so narrow and twisted they are known as rats' tails. And some women become their victims. The Badlands.
Arlene Arkinson, who's 5'4" of sturdy build with blonde shoulder-length hair, left her home in Castle Derg 6 weeks ago to go to a nightclub in Donegal.
She had no clothes, nothing, wear, no money or nothing. Arlene's not usually like that. On the 13th of August 1994, Arlene was in my house babysitting as we were at bingo, and she told me she got a phone call from Donegal earlier on, about 8 o'clock or around that, to ask her would she go out, and Arlene says that she was babysitting, and the guy was back from the bingo around that time, 10:30, 11:15.
Hiya, is Arlene in?
Hi, Arlene?
Is your mommy going? Aye, my mommy's going.
And when Donna came to the door, I said, who's all going? She says, oh, me, Mammy, Sean and Bob.
Robert Howard had come to Castle Derg some years before that and was associated with Pat Quinn, who was a middle-aged woman who had a teenage daughter called Donna, who was part of Arlene's circle of friends.
Do you have any money for me?
When Donna had asked Arlene to go, apparently she had said that Pat Quinn, her mother, who would have been another adult, was meant to be in the car, but she wasn't.
Howard's in the car, unknown to Kathleen, that arrangements seemed to have changed because at one stage Kathleen was told that Donna Quinn's mother, Pat, would have been coming along as well, but Pat Quinn didn't actually go to Bundoran.
That's the last time I saw Arlene.
Castle Derg, it's not far from the border with Donegal, a very popular location back in the day for sing-songs, bars, dances and so on. But it suffered heavily during the Troubles.
I knew Castle Derg to be a difficult, hard border town, you know, in which all kinds of harsh stories had taken place. Violence, intimidation, segregation, very, very divided Catholic Protestant communities. So I knew the town in that sense. I knew it to be a poor place.
Even in spite of the kind of divisions that there were because of the Troubles and because maybe of sectarian feeling, it was quite a small town and it's quite close-knit. It doesn't take long for news to travel from one end of the town to the other.
I formed a picture of Arlene from her family as this really lovely young girl who, yes, was a bit wayward, but only in the way of lots of young girls of her age. She seems to have been quite giddy. She seems to have been very pretty. She seems to have been really into socialising with her circle of friends. She had also had some bad experiences in her life. She had experienced the loss of her mother.
Your mother is that stability in your life, and that stability was then lost for Arlene at 11 years old. And what you had was siblings who then had to assume a responsibility.
She was flitting about between her siblings' homes, which was difficult for them, obviously, because who was going to have authority over her? I think she must have been quite challenging in that way to her brothers and sisters, but it was very, very apparent that they all loved her dearly.
The Sunday, the next day, I went over to Merton's house, I says, get Arlene up. Is there anything not back, Helen? That's checkers.
Because Arlene made it her business to sort of go between her siblings' homes, Kathleen wouldn't necessarily have been particularly alarmed that Arlene didn't come back to her house that night. But she did check with her brother the following day, and they did start asking among the family to try to find out where Arlene was.
The family started obviously to make inquiries as to what had become of Arlene on that Saturday night. They knew who she was with, but when she went to them, they were getting all sorts of different mixed up messages and stories about what had happened on the night. In fact, they were told at one stage that she hadn't actually gone out, that she had just gone, you know, a short distance up the road and had got out of the car and had disappeared. So I think that made them suspicious, obviously, about what had happened. But they also were very much on their guard about Robert Howard.
My sister Mary got arrested. She went up on the Tuesday, knocked the door. Howard came to Pat Quinn's front door, and Mary says, where's our Arlene at? And he says, I don't effing know. Mary says, you were at Bundoran, no? You took Arlene to Bundoran. And he just slammed the door. Our Mary came down to my house, and Mary says to me, I just didn't like the look of that boy. She says, he scared me. She said, he's done something to Arlene.
if you look at pictures of Howard, he was a pretty sinister-looking man. He looked like the sort of person you would not want your young daughter to be in the company of. He didn't hang around with local men, apparently. He would be sitting in the pub on his own, and then he would go and sit with young girls who were there, you know, and he was much older than him. He would have stuck out. I mean, teenage girls don't want the company of older adults, generally speaking, but because he put himself in this kind of quasi-paternal role where he was, you know, paying for drinks for them and things, he was popular with them.
I went into pack homes myself, and I says, you didn't see Arlene? No. I says, well, Patty, how'd you enjoy yourself? No, out on Saturday night. Oh, she's just brilliant. I said, if you see Arlene, tell her. I says, Martin's looking for her, and so am I. And we left, and she said, well, surely. Then I got Donna, asked her. She started to lie, got her a game, changed the story. Once I started changing the story, we knew then.
So how are you and Donna and the rest of the family feeling about this now?
Terrible, you know.
Do you think she'll turn up?
I'd love her to turn up right now. I'd like to see her turning up, definitely will.
Would you be hopeful that she will?
Yeah, no, like 6 weeks.
Kathleen did go and speak to the Quinns, and of course the Quinns lied to her. They believed that they were telling white lies, but they turned out to be catastrophic because it caused difficulties for the police.
We're becoming increasingly worried about this young woman's welfare, and I would appeal to her, if she's watching the programme, to get in touch with the police, with any member of her family or her parish priest.
The police did begin to investigate fairly promptly, and initial inquiries were made. But very loud, serious alarm bells should have rung immediately that they knew that Robert Howard was the last known adult in her company. Robert Howard was born in 1941 in a very rural part of County Laois called Wolf Hill. He apparently took on at quite a young age the name of the Wolfman of Wolf Hill. Robert was thrown out of home at a very young age before he was a teenager. So he got used at a very young age to living in the Badlands. And that part of the country, it's full of caves, it's full of old coal mines, it's full of old structures associated with derelict mines and so on. So as a boy, he would have known all of those kind of places. The first known assault that he carried out was in 1965 when he was in England. And he pretended to be a doctor and went into the room of a 6-year-old girl and pretended to be examining her physically and attempted to rape her. And for that crime, he was given 9 days in Borstal.
This man had been responsible for some horrific, heinous crimes that I would expect him never to have seen the light of day for. There was a case where he had repeatedly raped a woman who had disabilities. He had stuffed her mouth, I think it was with cotton wool, and only that somebody had come the next day to make sure she was okay. You know, you could have had another victim of Robert Howard. I, as a woman, feel perfectly justified in asking, how did Robert Howard end up back on the streets after a litany of crime before we even got to 1994?
Robert Hard told the police that he dropped Arlene near the housing estate where members of her family lived. But he also claimed that he dropped her outside of a pub in town where there were a number of boys hanging around. So the police subsequently did a search of the area around the pub, but they didn't seem to pay very much attention to Kathleen's consternation about the fact that her sister had last been seen in the company of a man who was known to everybody to have been extremely dangerous as far as young girls were concerned.
As far as the police are concerned, I think the key opportunities were missed in those crucial fortnight, those sort of 12 to 14 days after Arlene went missing. There were individual officers who were working really hard to try and join the dots and find out what had happened, but there just didn't seem to be any communication, there didn't seem to be any joined up thinking between uniformed officers and plainclothes officers. They were very slow in putting it on almost on a murder inquiry footing. There always seemed to be a sort of a feeling in the back of their minds that she's going to turn up, she'll turn up somewhere.
In cases of missing persons, it's often very difficult for us to assess very quickly as to whether a crime may have been committed or whether the individual is in fact missing or is away and just simply not wanting to be found. So some of those early investigative questions are always very difficult, and certainly in Arlene's case, that difficulty definitely did exist, which resulted in this case not escalating from being a uniformed investigation as it was at the time to becoming a major investigation. I think the time interval was somewhere around about 2 weeks. But today, you know, we would see that escalation much more rapidly.
I remember Kathleen Arkinson telling me at that time that a policeman had said to her, "I wish I could show you Robert Hard's record, it's as long as your arm." So it would appear that they did have access to the record. Kathleen knew it was hard, and so did other members of her family. They did their best to try to get the police to move on Hard. However, unfortunately, Pat Quinn, for some period of time, provided an alibi for Robert Hard and claimed that he had come home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she corroborated a story by Robert Hard that he had seen Arlene in a car in Castlederg the day after she was with him, you know, and all of these false stories were told.
The coroner makes it very clear in his findings that there was sufficient evidence upon which Robert Howard could have been arrested at a very early stage in the investigation. A very early decision to arrest would enable us to secure forensic evidence, either from the suspect or from a vehicle or from an address. It also may have helped for those alibis that were falsely created not to have developed in such a significant way that it felt like there was an element of truth. Certainly the suspect being in custody wouldn't enable him to have manipulated other individuals around him, to have created the alibi, the web of lies and deceit that existed. And that may have enabled us to break through the case much more quickly. Unfortunately, in this case, that didn't happen.
He is then, at that time, out on bail in relation to a very serious assault on another child. Just 16 years of age. And she was held captive in Howard's flat. She was drugged and raped over an extensive period of time. Then, when she was able to come round and get to her senses, escaped from Howard by jumping out the window and made her way to the local police station at Castlederg. He was then charged with a series of very serious offences that really, on any level and any other jurisdiction, would have amounted to custody. He should never have been on bail. How did the alarm bells not go off? He's out on bail for raping another child. He's the last person to be in the company of Arlene. You better get him. Who else could it be? And so they don't do anything about it, which to me is just absolutely appalling.
It's not as if the police in Castlederg were not experienced. They were working in an area where there had been a very active IRA presence. They will have investigated murders before. It was something like 46 days later that Howard was arrested, which is absolutely astonishing.
By the lack of proper police activity, particularly at a more senior level, allowed Howard to absolutely destroy all evidential opportunities.
I don't understand why his car wasn't immediately searched. There should have been enough known from his record to recognise that the car would be of interest for forensic reasons. This is the car in which poor Arlene probably spent her last hours. By the time the police did investigate his car, it had been sold across the border to somebody else, and it was undoubtedly cleaned up at that point.
The prosecution, in the case of the other young girl, got an expert psychiatric opinion of Howard. And this guy was just a complete menace and a danger, a psychopath. And they'd have known all this, but still he's not charged with, you know, the murder of Arlene.
I would have done regular pieces with Kathleen and the family. You know, I'd have marked anniversaries, for example. From time to time, there would have been sightings, and the police would have maybe made appeals about a particular sighting of a girl who maybe resembled Arlene in a certain area. I think there were a couple maybe in England. And that really just kept the story almost ticking over. But for all intents and purposes, the trail had run cold.
In 1995, Howard came up in court for the offences against the 16-year-old girl. They had, of course, by that stage been seriously reduced, but he got a 3-year suspended sentence. Howard was apparently driven out of Castlederg by people associated with the IRA, and he then retreated to a caravan somewhere down about the border.
He then fled Ireland altogether, and I think the next time really he comes onto the radar, he's in Glasgow. Then his identity is revealed in Glasgow, and I think it was published in a paper, and he fled again from Glasgow. Then out of the blue, on the April of '96, the police arrived at Kathleen's house and began a search. There were media there that morning when they arrived. The story obviously broke very quickly and very dramatically.
I remember walking up towards this van load of police officers, armed with pickaxes and shovels and whatever else, and realising that this story had moved to a completely new level.
Ornaments and ashtrays were flung out through the windows at the police, and there was a standoff for about 15 minutes. And eventually, I'm told the RUC had to use a sledgehammer to force their way into the house, up the stairs, and according to Kathleen, who was in bed, handcuffed her.
I think what made the whole thing worse was that the family had been trying to fight for justice for Arlene, and then they are suddenly seen to be suspect. But also, the cameras were there ready to record this humiliating incident where Kathleen was obviously really angry and really distraught.
You know, they say they had to restrain Kathleen, they had to do this, they had to do that. Well, what did they expect? What would anyone expect when the police and force arrive at the end of a small cul-de-sac and a small housing estate with the police and the media on tow to dig up your home?
They had to do it because they were ashamed and discriminated that they had to come into my house and do this. So they just wanted to look in front of them, and that's the way they done this to me and my family.
Anything that we do alongside the media is done for a very clear investigative purpose. It doesn't preclude us from taking difficult decisions, sometimes to do difficult things. There will be a deliberate decision that's taken to conduct our media engagement in a particular way because there's a need for us to do it in that particular way, but that's a decision to be taken at the time by the specific SIO.
My recollection is that that dig was undertaken as a result of an anonymous tip-off. You know, so clearly questions need to be asked in terms of where did that come from and what motivated the police to take that so seriously that they thought that it was a legitimate call, that they felt that they would create what effectively was a whole public furore, I suppose, around the family and around Kathleen, who was, I suppose, the single voice in all of this, leading a call for justice for her sister, and yet here the tables are turned.
While the police say they recognise the distress caused to the Arkinsons, they insist they followed a line of inquiry that couldn't be ignored.
If the source is reliable, why didn't the police at the time, since they were in Kathleen's kitchen the day before, say, look, we have some distressing information, you're not going to like it, but this is the allegation that has been made, we know it's uncomfortable, but the only way around this is that you let us search your home? And I have no doubt that Kathleen would have said, well, of course.
They had to come in and ask me, you know, can I go into your garden? We got a tip-off, Arlie was in the garden. I says, knock the house down if you want it, sir. You know, do what you want. I don't care. It was the way they done it. It was unbelievable.
At just after 9 o'clock this morning, police arrested Stephen Walsh, who lives at the house with Kathleen Arkinson.
Then when it comes to nothing, they place Kathleen's partner in the police car in front of everybody, being arrested as a suspect for Arlene's murder, which was just awful. They had no basis at all to pursue him, but of course what it did took the heat off Howard, and it looked as if they were doing something. The relationship between the Arkinsons and the police, it didn't recover, it will never recover, and it can't recover as a result of that.
It tarnishes how people reflect back on the people involved in the case. And if you compare it with the 46 days to arrest Robert Howard, but yet there they go on an anonymous tip-off to dig up the garden of a woman who has single-handedly and with sheer determination tried to find her sister. And I think certainly it's legitimate to look back and ask, why did that happen?
Some of the neighbours even was wondering round here, is there a body? There's nothing was here.
Even after it all subsided, it became very difficult for Kathleen to work up any kind of sympathy locally and to kind of continue her campaign to keep Arlene's case in the public eye. It was difficult just to keep the case alive and to keep it in the public eye because, to be honest, there wasn't that much to report. Then, out of the blue, came a report that Robert Howard had been charged in connection with the discovery of a teenager's body in the south of England. And that was a bombshell.
A man has appeared in court charged with the murder of schoolgirl Hannah Williams. 58-year-old Robert Howard has been remanded in custody.
So at that point, it gave things a new lease of life, because I knew that this would have ramifications in Northern Ireland. I knew that his connection with Arlene was bound to come up in the court in England.
At that time in Kent Police, I was a Detective Chief Inspector, running one of the murder teams at Major Crime. We had a phone call into Kent Police to say that the skeletal remains of a young girl had been found at what we called the Blue Circles area, which was being redeveloped for the Ebbsfleet Rail Terminal. A digger driver exposed the skeletal remains of a young girl who would later be identified as Hannah Williams.
Hannah's 14. She liked to go for walks, shopping. Typical 14-year-old, basically. Loved her music, loved buying clothes, shoes.
I attended the scene with other officers, and our priority at that stage was to try and identify, one, who she was. Secondly, could we determine a cause of death? Certainly it wasn't a natural death, having been wrapped up and tied in a blue tarpaulin. What was also apparent was there was a rope around her neck, a ligature.
Hannah Williams was last seen at her home in Deptford in South London in April last year. Her body was found buried in Northfleet in Kent nearly a year after she disappeared.
As soon as we found out that it was Hannah, we found on the morning she disappeared, she had a 14-second phone call from a woman that actually lived very, very close to the deposition site. She said she was a care worker and had been working nights. So at the time of the phone call, she'd have been actually in bed asleep. So the question was then asked, who made that phone call? And she said, the only person who could have done was my partner, Robert Howard. Well, we put Robert Howard's details into the police national computer, and instantly he became our #1 suspect. Looking at Howard's antecedents, it was clear that he had been arrested previously in connection with the disappearance of Arlene Arkinson. So my priority then was to contact the PSNI. I asked the SIO if he was going to arrest Robert Howard. And at that point, the answer was no, he wasn't. The problem that posed was he remained a free man. Apart from the 14-second phone call, which actually proved very little, if anything, we had no evidence against Howard apart from our suspicion. So we put surveillance on his home, and whenever he left the property, we followed him quite openly. If he went to the local shop, the police were behind him. When he went into the local police station to complain about the police were behind him. And people might say that's an overreaction, but if during our inactivity a girl was abducted, raped and murdered, could any one of us have looked in the mirror and said we'd done our job properly? And the answer is no.
Kent Police took what was probably a very high-stakes gamble, because they relied upon the evidence of what Howard had done in Northern Ireland to try and build a case against him in England, because they felt that there were so many similarities between what he had been accused of in Northern Ireland and what they alleged had carried out in England. So in order to do that, they needed to revisit all these cases. They needed to revisit the attack on the teenager in Castlederg and also the circumstances of Arlene's disappearance.
The family liaison officer and myself interviewed the young victim that had been held in Robert Howard's flat in Castle Derg. She described being enticed to that flat, complaining of a headache, and Robert Howard gave her tablets. It would later transpire that she'd been sedated. She said she woke up naked in his bed with a noose tied around her neck, which he continually tightened, also at the same time as raping her. Significantly, for us, the evidence of a noose around her neck fitted exactly what had happened to Hannah, but already we're now starting to see what I would later call similar fact evidence. In one of my early visits to Northern Ireland, I spoke to the SIO and said I wanted to meet Kathleen and the family. I was told that wasn't possible because, in his words, Kathleen and the family were very difficult to deal with and I wouldn't get anything from her. And far from being uncooperative, on the first occasion I met, she asked me questions that quite clearly should have been directed at the RUC many years ago, and in fact had been directed at the RUC, but she'd never had the answers. It was clear, in my view, that this was a family that had not been looked after in respect of that investigation. What Kathleen made clear was that she would help us, Kent Police, do whatever we could to prosecute Robert Howard for Hannah Williams, hoping in some way that that would open the door to a possible prosecution in relation to Arlene. Preparing for the trial at Maidstone Crown Court, without any notice at all, I was informed that Robert Howard had been flown to Northern Ireland, where he was charged with the murder of Arlene Arkinson.
Earlier, as Robert Howard arrived at court in a police car, he was shouted at by members of the Arkinson family.
Now, I was amazed because it seemed to me that there was no more evidence at that point than there was several years ago. And where we'd been asking for Robert Howard to be charged, suddenly it had happened.
The detective inspector was asked if the police were any nearer to learning what had happened to Arlene Arkinson. He replied, "I can't comment."
It's very hard to know what to read into the fact that he was charged so quickly with the Arlene murder after such a long delay, but so quickly after the Hannah Williams one. Because obviously at that point, the police in Northern Ireland did recognise that there was a pattern. They must have at least contemplated using same fact evidence, because they were in a much worse position in the sense that they didn't have a body.
Similar fact evidence had never been used in a murder trial before. And the less evidence you have, the stronger that similar fact has to be. The fact that we had the ligature around Hannah's neck, the fact that the young girl attacked in Robert Howard's flat had a ligature around her neck, was so significant that if the trial judge would allow the jury to consider that, we felt that there was every chance of a successful prosecution. And after careful consideration, obviously the judge considered that it was pertinent, and the evidence was given of the attack in Castle Derg. Kathleen did give evidence at our trial.
This was an unusual approach, that you were actually bringing in witnesses to talk about an alleged offence that hadn't been through a court in Northern Ireland, that they hadn't been convicted of. When we got to the verdict, it was a day of great tension. There was great drama in the court. It could have gone either way, but when he was found guilty, There were scenes of relief.
I'm glad justice has been done for Hannah, but I want Bob Howard to stand trial for the murder of my sister, Arlene, and I want him to give up her body.
Needless to say, they came back to Northern Ireland then feeling confident that when Howard would be tried, they would have fully expected that the police in Northern Ireland would also apply similar case evidence. Instead of which, what happened was that Howard was brought from prison to be tried in Northern Ireland, but his past record wasn't brought up.
The jury in Belfast weren't told either of Howard's past in terms of sexual attacks on women and young girls, or indeed the fact that he had been convicted of the murder of Hannah Williams.
I don't really have a very clear understanding of why that similar fact evidence or the evidence of our conviction was never introduced. Because I think if it had have been, it would have been compelling.
The technique of introducing similar fact evidence was quite a new one. But also I think there was a fear that by introducing similar fact evidence and perhaps giving Howard an avenue for appeal, even if he was convicted, that both convictions then might have been challenged, that it might have opened the Kent conviction to challenge as well as the conviction for the murder of Arlene.
Robert Howard was found not guilty of murdering 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson after a lengthy trial. The jury felt there was not enough evidence to convict him of the murder.
I can remember when the jury acquitted him, he showed no emotion whatsoever, but there was just an outburst, I think, of grief amongst the Arkinson family and the court.
We've always said our top priority has been to recover Arlene's body. That's still the case, and we are calling on the police to continue their searches, and we'll not rest until our sister is found and given a decent burial.
That was an absolutely devastating blow to the Arkinson family after all of the work and campaigning and heartache that they had been through in the intervening years. And of course, that was the last chance.
Kathleen and her family, Pauline and other members of the family, their world had almost finished at that verdict being introduced. Bad enough not knowing where Arlene was, but bad enough then to see the man that they knew was responsible for their sister's death getting away with it.
Well, like, it was frustrating for us to sit there and know his record, and the jury didn't know. It was unfair. It must be made now that any person that gets to stand in front of a judge and jury, their past should be read out before they get into that dock.
Later around 2006, 2007, that's when I first had been contacted by the Arkinson family in order to represent them at that stage, which was an inquest. My knowledge at the time, it's really what the public knew, that's what I knew. And it was only during the course of pursuing the matter further that I became even more horrified. I thought we'll get a number of files I expect in the usual way. Maybe 5, 6 files may arrive, lever arch files from the police, and we'll just take it from there. I remember when I stood in my office and looked out the window and noticed the PSNI vehicles pulling up outside my office, filled with lever arch folders. That's when I got the sense of there's a lot more to this case than simply the murder of a child. I'm not going to say it was going to be a basic inquest and it was going to be straightforward. I knew there were going to be difficulties, but I never anticipated what was going to happen.
An inquest has been beset by years of delays.
Another day in court, another day of disappointment for the family of Arlene Arkinson.
The court heard of another potential delay, the granting of legal aid for Robert Howard, who'll be called as a witness at the inquest by video link.
The inquest has been adjourned until next week.
There was a really start-stop nature to it. As a journalist, it became very, very difficult to follow it because dates would be put in the diary, then they'd be moved, you know, hearings would start and then be adjourned, and it was agonising for the family because they had to try and attend most of these hearings, and it dragged on for years.
We had 40 preliminary hearings. There was such a debacle about the documents, because then it transpired that I may have got documents I wasn't supposed to get. And then I may have got documents that weren't properly redacted. And then I may have got documents I should never had viewed at all.
22 years after Arlene Arkinson disappeared, her family were hoping to find out what happened. But all the information about the police investigation may not be heard. The PSNI have asked for a public interest immunity certificate to withhold some of the details from the inquest.
First day of evidence in February 2016. The lights are on and we're ready to go at last, our first live witness. And you turn up that morning and the problem is that a PAI certificate has landed. PAI stands for Public Interest Immunity. PAI certificate is signed by a government minister which is served on the relevant parties in a legal case, effectively to say this information, if it gets into the public domain, is catastrophic. It cannot happen on the grounds of national security. These things happen in other cases that are deemed political or involving paramilitaries, but not in relation to the death of a 15-year-old child. It just sets an awful tone because you really do at that stage go, well, why are we doing this? What is the point? We're never going to get anywhere. And it's designed to make the family walk away because that's what they want. Kathleen was smart enough to take that system on, and she was never going to give up, and it's just so brilliant to see that. Kathleen was just pursuing that thing that all families pursue: truth, justice and accountability.
Kathleen really hoped, the family really hoped, that they would get Howard back in the witness box through the inquest. The ultimate devastating blow came along that Howard died before he was ever actually called to give evidence. With that, the kind of last flickering hope of getting some information out of Howard in terms of finding Arlene's remains.
Quite poignant going back up to Castle Derg. Obviously, Robert Howard, deceased, no longer about. Kathleen still living in Castle Derg with her family. Understand Castle Derg's been redeveloped somewhat. So yeah, mixed emotions really. We'd spent time travelling to and from Northern Ireland and then came up to Castle Derg. I think my first visit was to the police station where I met Kathleen and family. And it was on one of those occasions that we came down and looked at the main square, went into the property. This is where Robert Howard, the man who murdered Hannah and Arlene, lived. It was pretty derelict, and myself and the family liaison officer were able to go into the property. Obviously it's not there, but I can remember it as if it was yesterday.
Patricia Quinn, in the navy tracksuit top, arrives at the inquest into Arlene Arkinson's death with her daughter Donna, who was one of the last people to see the schoolgirl alive.
He's happy now, he's got enough.
The one thing that Pat Quinn said in the witness box, the one thing that I think stuck with everybody was her opening remarks was that we all knew Howard was an informer. You know, he always had money. Somebody who's unemployed or on the dole, but they always seem to constantly have money. Suspicions arise. When you break down all the complications in Arlene's case and you look at the basic facts for what was known, it doesn't make sense, so you have to try to work out the why. And you do come to the conclusion that there must have been some relationship between Howard and the police. I'm not saying that he was some high-level agent operating, you know, for MI5. I mean, that's obviously not the case. But informants come in different guises and at different levels.
He was free to roam in the Castle Derg area. I don't think he was a significant informant, but there is that speculation.
I just can't see of what value he would have been to the authorities. I think this is more likely to have, sadly, to just have been shortcomings in the criminal justice system.
One of the most bizarre circumstances within the inquest is the evidence of Norman Baxter, who was the investigating officer for a period of time in March 2002 and did take the decision that Howard should be prosecuted.
By 2002, he told the court, "I would say she was a forgotten victim. That's quite a terrible thing." And he added later, Robert Howard could have been charged years earlier.
It was a bit of a turning point because it was not the judicial confirmation that we were seeking, but it was the first sort of police confirmation that what Kathleen had been saying all these years was true. Towards the end, another PII matter has arisen, and it is of great significance. And what it effectively was, an informant working for the police within the prison was secretly recording Howard, and that Howard had disclosed how he had killed Arlene. Kathleen and her family, they are totally flabbergasted. They want to hear this information, but then we can't tell them who the source is because the police won't tell us. We're not allowed to know. It's another agent within the prison, and we can't get any details of how, when and where all this happened. As the evidence was read out, I remember Howard describing how he held Arlene over the sink. And the key thing that I remember the agent said is that Howard said that Arlene put up a good fight. It's portrayed to us on the basis that this was their attempt to get him to make an admission. The reason why then, of course, it becomes very convenient is because by this stage, Howard's dead. There's no more lawyers acting on his behalf to object to any of this or to say anything about it. How's it only coming about now? Because we had plenty of time to be told about this in advance. Why do this to this family? What are you doing? I mean, why don't you just be open about this from day one? And that's never been the case here.
There are so many questions around the disappearance of Arlene Arkinson. Today, her family arrived at Omagh Courthouse hoping to hear some answers about what happened to Arlene 27 years ago.
After a case that lasted 14 years, dealing with the disappearance of a child after 27 years, it's really a day I thought would never come.
It was a hugely momentous day for Kathleen. It became apparent very early in the coroner's report that he spoke very respectfully of the Arkinson family. And I think that that was a tremendous relief to Kathleen because she had had a lot of experience of not being treated respectfully.
This was a 14-year-old inquest, nearly as long as Arlene's life. An inquest that Howard and the state never wanted. There is now no doubt that Robert Gazera Howard murdered my 15-year-old sister Arlene and hid her body. I appeal to the Justice Minister to examine Arlene's case carefully, and when she does, she will see that the need for a public inquiry into the activity of Robert Howard and the jurisdiction and his status as an agent for the RUC, which has led to the death and misery for many people. Thank you.
Thank you. I've never had a case like it. It was an emotional roller coaster as well as a legal one. What struck me was the dignity of the Arkinson family, and particularly the dignity of Kathleen, who endured this for so long. So, I mean, it was great to see her getting her day in court.
We need a full inquiry which takes in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. What can police learn? What can public prosecutors learn? What can single parents learn? What can families learn? What can communities learn? What can social services learn from the case of someone like Robert Howard, who has had an unknown number of victims and has ruined so many people's lives?
Well, I think from the family's point of view, they will never be the same. It certainly has not been the finest hour of Northern Ireland's criminal justice system. The police, prosecutors, even the coroner's system, the inquest system, I think, have questions to answer about how this has all been handled. Essentially, a teenager was plucked from this earth, was murdered, and her body disposed of, and her body has never been found, and her family have never got justice.